Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium and History is Lunch. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you've not already, please silence your cell phones. A few things coming up that you should know about. The Mississippi Book Festival will be August 18th. This is the fourth year for it. It takes place over the grounds of the state capitol. It's hot, but it's always great. I think the full schedule was released online today. Salman Rushdie is coming, and there are a lot of other great authors that will be participating in that. So take a look and make your plans to come to that. And then I hope that you'll be able to join us here next week when Julian Rankin will be with us to discuss his new book, Catfish Dream, Ed Scott's Fight for His Family Farm and Racial Justice in the Mississippi Delta. We were scheduled to have University of Mississippi Assistant Professor of Southern Studies Brian Foster with us today to talk about the state's live blues circuit. A family situation prevented him from being with us, and we will reschedule his program. Our friends at Mississippi State University have stepped in to save us, though. Their only condition was that when the other program does take place, we introduce Brian Foster as Assistant Professor of Southern Studies at the school up north. We are delighted to have David S. Nolen to discuss the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library and Museum, a state-of-the-art facility chronicling Grant's life and significance in American history that opened last November at Mississippi State University. Dave Nolen is an associate professor at Mississippi State University and the associate editor and reference librarian of the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library and Congressional and Political Research Center. He earned his MLIS degree from the University of Alabama and holds an MA in Spanish from the University of Florida and a BA in Spanish and Latin American Studies from the University of Alabama. Help me welcome David Nolen.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? All right. Well, thank you all for being here today. And Chris, thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you all today. I want to give you a little kind of outline of where we're going as I'm talking through the slides here this afternoon. I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of the Ulysses S. Grant Association and the work that they have done over the years. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about how the Grant project actually ended up at Mississippi State University, which I think, based on the informal polling I did, is the number one question here today. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today during this presentation. And then I want to talk about kind of the evolution of the physical space that we have dedicated to the Grant project at Mississippi State, and kind of show you some of the behind-the-scenes look at the design, and then give you a little maybe virtual tour of the space and show you some things that ordinarily you don't get to see on a tour. And then I want to wrap up, if time permits, with just kind of giving you a little teaser of some of my favorite items that are on display in the museum spaces right now. So let me start by talking a little bit about the history of the Grant Association. The association was actually founded in 1962 as part of the Civil War Centennial commemoration. And it was a joint project by the state Civil War Centennial Commissions from Illinois, Ohio, and New York, right? 3 states that have really strong ties to Ulysses S. Grant, but also leading historians of the Civil War from that era, and also Grant descendants were involved in the founding of the association. And the association was founded to really collect and make accessible all of Grant's known writings. Now, why was this even necessary, right? In the time period that Grant was president, there was not a presidential library system. And so when he left office, his papers did not go into the National Archives and Records Administration's purview. They instead went with him. And so over time, his papers were sort of scattered to the 4 winds, right? They ended up in the hands of family members who kept them as mementos. They ended up in different repositories and archives around the country and even around the world. A lot of documents ended up in the hands of private collectors who held on to those and passed them down and sold them at auction and things like that. And so the association was founded to really kind of track down all of those items, see where they were, see what had survived of Grant's papers, and make them available to a wider public. Now, someone who was instrumental in that was John Y. Simon. He was the historian who was tasked with sort of following through with this project, and he oversaw it for many years. And we owe him a real debt of gratitude for all the work that he did over time. Because you think about, in 1962, he was out pounding the pavement and making phone calls and writing letters to be able to contact people and actually just see if he could obtain a copy of a grant document and see if they knew of where other grant documents were. So there was a lot of legwork that went into that initial work of the association. Now, the early goal was to make these accessible by publishing them in volumes of the series, The Papers of Ulysses S. Grant. When they first started in 1962, the ambition was to do about 15 volumes, maybe 20. And this picture will illustrate the project grew a little bit beyond that. And eventually the Grant Association produced 32 volumes of the Papers of Ulysses S. Grant. Now, the 32 volumes actually represent only a small percentage of the documents in the collection. And so we have this massive research collection that has been compiled by the editors over the years and really is an unbelievable collection. Now, speaking of this process, I want to get a little bit into kind of a nuts and bolts example of what the editors actually did. Right now, when we think about making documents accessible, we think about digitizing them, putting them on the web, right? But in 1962, what they would do is they would transcribe these, publish them in these volumes, right? Because that made it available to a wide number of individuals and also libraries. So sometimes we get into a little bit of awkward moments when we're talking to people about what we do as editors. Because there are a couple of terms, and neither of these terms really work well, right? When we talk to people and say that we are editors of historical documents, sometimes people kind of narrow their eyes and step back and say, what are you trying to hide, right? Because there's this presumption that we're redacting things from the documents. That's not what we're doing. But equally bad if we say that we are documentary editors, right? People's eyes light up and they say, oh, what kind of films do you make? And when we have to say, well, we don't actually make films, sorry about that. And then we have to deal with their disappointment, right, if we're at a social function as they try to drift away because they don't really want to know what we're doing. But I can assure you that documentary editing of historical documents is actually very interesting and is very important work. Let me just show you this example here. So this is an item from our collection. If you can look at it closely here, you can see there's a stamp on it that shows that this is a copy obtained from the National Archives. And if you look closely up here, you can see that the date on the letter is July 3rd, 1863. The location is near Vicksburg. And it's Grant writing to Confederate General John C. Pemberton. Right? If you know anything about the history of Vicksburg, this is a pretty important moment, and this is a pretty important document in that. Right? This is part of the exchange leading up to the surrender of the city. This is one of those letters that's often quoted because Grant uses the phrase here at the start of the second paragraph about the useless effusion of blood that he and Pemberton would like to stop at that point. And so you look at this, and Grant's handwriting, pretty good. Looks pretty clear. Yeah, more or less. Some people are tentatively nodding their heads. Yeah, it's not too bad by 19th century standards. But right, think about our undergraduate students who have come through and have not learned cursive as we did in elementary school. This looks like hieroglyphics to them, right? So the first step in making this document more accessible to a wider public is just doing a TypeScript transcription, right? Already, this is more accessible. This is easier to read because you don't have to understand cursive. You don't have to get used to Grant's unique handwriting style. So this was the first step that the editors would sort of make anytime that they had selected a document to be included in the Grant papers. So this provides a certain level of accessibility, right? It's easier to read. But if we look at the actual letter here, this is in volume 8 of the Grant papers, you see that the transcription part is just really the first half of this page. And you look up there and you see, all right, they've preserved the spelling, they've preserved the formatting, right, as much as possible, so that it looks like the original. But then when you get down to the bottom, this is really where a lot of the sort of next level accessibility comes in. All of these are notes relating to the context of the document and helping the reader understand what's going on. This is what we like to refer to as intellectual accessibility, right? So that the reader can understand the context of the letter and not just read the letter itself out of context. So these notes, the annotations here, are exceedingly rich. There are all kinds of notes about the location of original versions of this letter, right? Copies that were made by clerks and things like that. Usually the notes will include the letter that may have prompted Grant to write this letter, right? So the letter he's responding to. It may also include other later parts of the same exchange. And if you look here, we flip on to the next page, right? So you've got a half-page letter, and then you've got half a page, the next full page, and on to the next page. All of those are notes relating to that one entry. So for this one letter in our collection, we have a group of file folders about this thick with all of the editor's notes relating to the research that went into contextualizing that document. And you can imagine doing that across 32 volumes for every single letter. Not all of them have that much research that goes into it, but this gives you kind of an idea of the work of the association and the effort that goes into researching these documents. So this process went on for a number of years. The project at that time was housed at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, which is where Dr. John Y. Simon was a faculty member for many years. So in 2008, there were several very important changes that took place. The first thing is that the association and Southern Illinois University had a dissolving of their relationship, okay? Everyone always wants to know more details about that. There was an out-of-court settlement that basically contains a gag order that no one affiliated with the Grant Association or Southern Illinois can talk about the nature of what led to that relationship dissolving. I have young children. The general consensus is that they don't want Daddy to go to prison, so I'm going to leave it at that here today and not go into any further details. But I can tell you about a few other things that happened in 2008. So as the association was looking for a new host institution, unfortunately, Dr. John Y. Simon passed away during that summer of 2008. And then the Grant Association Board named Dr. John F. Marzalak as the new executive director and managing editor of the project. Many of you know Dr. Marzalak. He is a well-known Civil War historian. I think we could say he's not here, so we can say he's an all-around great guy, too, if you know him. But he was named the new executive director and managing editor. And so that created this opportunity for Mississippi State University to really begin exploring becoming the new host institution for this project. Dr. Marzalak was able to really communicate to the university administration, the library administration, about how vital this project was and how valuable it would be to Mississippi State and just the great opportunity that was there. And so in 2008, after Dr. Marzalak was named executive director, in December of that year, a couple of semi-trucks drove down from Carbondale and unloaded all kinds of materials into the Mitchell Memorial Library, and that became the new home and the new host institution for the Grant Association. So once the materials moved, this was a big deal because they had to pick up where Dr. Simon and his editors sort of left off. And they had been in process of finishing volume 31 of the Grant papers. So Dr. Marzalak and the editors who came before me actually completed volume 31 and then began and completed the work on volume 32, finishing out that series. And so in 2013, I actually had the opportunity to move from another area of the library into the Grant project to work on the Personal Memoirs project. Now, much of this presentation is shameless self-promotion. This is the most shameless of the self-promotion here. We were very, very pleased to be able to bring this forth last October. This was published by Harvard University Press. It was a work that had really been in process since 1962. The original plan was to do an annotated edition of Grant's memoirs once they finished the the Papers Project. And so we felt like we were just sort of standing on the shoulders of giants in completing this project as part of that long plan. But you may be familiar with Grant's memoirs, one of the biggest and sort of most popular memoirs in the Civil War memoir genre. It's never been out of print. But many of the references that Ulysses S. Grant makes in the volume are a little bit obscure to modern readers, right? He was writing for an audience that was intimately familiar with the Civil War, had lived through portions of it, or had known everyone who was involved in the aftermath. And so for us, it's a little bit inaccessible, right? Intellectually inaccessible, because we don't catch all the cultural references. Or when he says, and that was Captain Jones, who rose to fame in the late war, that's lost on us as modern readers. So what we did is we added about 2,060, not that I'm counting closely, footnotes to this work. And those footnotes explain who those people are, who those obscure references are. They actually wade in and correct dates or other places where the original text is incorrect. And so we were very excited to bring that forth. I'll tell you a personal anecdote there. My daughter, my middle child, is 5, and she was born right before I began work with the Grant Memoirs Project. And just a couple of months ago, my wife was sitting at the computer at our house, and Anna Ruth looked at me and she said, "Daddy, is Mama working on the memoirs?" And I thought, yes, your entire life, someone has been sitting at that computer working on the memoirs. And so just kind of an example of the labor of love that went into this work here. But let me talk to you a little bit about the move to MSU and the physical facility there. Right, we've talked a little bit about the work of the association and all the different things that were going on. When the project was housed at Southern Illinois, it was housed in an annex of the library, and it was not open to the public. Right, the collection was just there for the use of the editors who were working on the Papers Project. And so you couldn't go in and do research there. You couldn't go in and look at artifacts there. They just weren't set up for that kind of thing. That was part of the proposal in moving the collection to Mississippi State. And it was interesting, right, because when we brought the materials to Mississippi State, we put them in the same facility as the Congressional and Political Research Center. All right, the CPRC is sort of our modern political archives. John C. Stennis, his papers are there, about 4,000 archival boxes of material. Congressman Sonny Montgomery, those are also part of the CPRC collections. And we felt like it made a lot of sense, right? Grant was president. He's a politician. He was a Union general during the Civil War. That's a very political activity as well. And so it fit to put that collection in with the CPRC collections. So we had a really nice setup. We had a reading room, which you see here, which also doubled as kind of an exhibit space. You can see the doors there where our offices were. We could process archival materials there. We had storage for a lot of the Grant papers and all of that. Because by this point, the Grant collection consisted of about 17,000 linear feet of material and contained what we believe to be a copy, at least, if not the original, of every letter sent or received by Grant during his lifetime. So this is a massive collection. So we were grateful for this setup. But we found as we opened the collection to the public and let people come in to use the research materials, the profile of the project raised, right? And so we had people approaching us, descendants, we had collectors, actually communicating with us and saying, we have materials that we'd like to donate to you. So we had a very limited exhibit space here, although we were grateful to have that. But in 2012, when the association designated the collection at Mississippi State as the Grant Presidential Library, we added a little area just outside of that main physical space where we had a little more flexibility for exhibits. And so we could unlock this and kind of give a guided tour, and it just helped us a lot with all the different artifacts that all of a sudden we were kind of collecting and receiving. Now, it also made for some awkward moments, as you might imagine, right? The collection is exceedingly valuable. It's very rich as far as researchers are concerned. And so people like Ron Chernow, Ron White, Chuck Calhoun, all of them working on recent grant books. They came and spent extended time with us and looked through these collections. So you might have a researcher who's very focused, digging through these collections, and all of a sudden here come 80 fourth graders from the local elementary school. And they come right into the same space. And right beside the researcher is a team of undergraduate student workers, and they may literally be digging through garbage bags because we've gotten a new donation, and people are sorting that out. And all of this is happening, and meanwhile we're doing all of our editorial work and answering reference questions all in the same space, right? The children were always weirded out by researchers sitting in the research room. The researchers, rightly, I think, were sort of terrified of large groups of children coming in and disrupting their research. So something had to be done, right? And this was part of the long-term plan in moving the collection to Mississippi State, was providing a permanent physical space so that we could do all these different functions. So, in 2013, we really began work in earnest designing a new facility to house the grant project. Dr. Keenum and others in the MSU administration approached the state legislature and worked with them on getting a bond issue to fund new construction. As we were working with the architects and engineers, they made what we considered an interesting discovery about the physical space at the Mitchell Memorial Library, which how many of you have visited the Mitchell Memorial Library? Very good, okay. So you may know the Mitchell Library was built sort of in three phases. Right? There's the 1950s section of the building, then there's the part that was added on in the 1970s, and then the large addition that kind of doubled the floor plan of it, or the footprint of the building, in the 1990s. Well, what they determined was that the 1970s section had been built with the idea that it could go up 7 floors if necessary. And they only went up 3 floors, and so, according to the architects and engineers, they said, well, it'll be no big deal to just put a floor on top of that section. And so that's what we started doing. We started building a new floor, a 4th floor, onto the top of the 1970s section of the building. Now, this made us exceedingly popular on campus. If you have been to an MSU football game over the last 5 years, you probably got in some bad traffic, and that was our fault. At least we're told that was our fault, because they put a tower crane right in the middle of Rhode. And they were lifting up big girders and all sorts of materials to build this superstructure on top of the library. So Rhode was closed all of that time, and the day it opened, I thought we were going to have a parade down that street because people were so excited to have that street access back. So if we look through here a little bit, we began working while they're doing the construction on how we're going to design the interiors, and in particular the museum spaces. We worked with 4 different vendors in this sort of phase of the project. Healy Kohler Design out of the Washington, D.C. area was really kind of they were our point people for this process. Terrence Healy was excellent in terms of getting us to sort of think through what are the stories that we want to tell. How do we illustrate those stories with the artifacts and documents that we have in the collection? And what kind of story do we want to bring forward? And so he really worked with us in thinking through that. And one of the things that we came to, especially in the design of the Grant museum space and also with the Lincoln space, was that we really wanted to take these sort of monolithic, unapproachable figures in American history and make them more approachable. Right? We wanted to remind people of the very human stories about them so that they're not just mythic or mythological kind of figures in the American history. They're actual people. One of the stories that we really brought out in the Grant Gallery was the aspect of Grant as a sort of doting husband and father. Right? That's not a story that often gets told about Grant, but he concluded almost all of his letters to his wife with hugs and kisses for you, dear Julia, and the children. And so these are things that we wanted to bring out in the telling of these stories. We also worked with Relative Scale out of North Carolina to design touchscreen interactive exhibits. And they were great to work with. They helped us with the Myth Interactive. They created short films about Grant's life. interactive timelines about the Civil War and the Grant presidency, where you can answer trivia questions about some of the material there, or you can send a digital postcard to a friend or loved one saying, "Wish you were here," right? And so all of those things really help to enhance that storytelling. We also worked with Studio Ice out of Brooklyn, New York, to create 4 life-size statues of Ulysses S. Grant that are in the space. And I'll show you some images of those in a moment. And then we worked with Formations out of Portland, Oregon, and they did a lot of the creation of the casework that we have there. So we wanted to really engage people, right? And we were involved in all of this museum design. I know those who are involved in the museum design here are familiar with that experience of, kind of you have these different pieces of content and you're looking at how are they going to all come together. And the plans became more and more refined, right? And we would get these architectural drawings and we'd kind of scratch our heads and go, is this all going to come together? How is this going to work exactly? And it was hard for us to visualize because we were working on these different pieces and we were working with different people. But then we got to 2017, and we actually had to shut down the whole operation to move all of the stuff upstairs from the 2,200 square foot space that we were in down on the first floor that I showed you some images of to a 21,000 square foot space on the 4th floor. And it was a little bit difficult for us because we had to shut down and couldn't give tours, right? Which that's one of the things that we always enjoyed, was seeing people come in and engage with the materials and answering questions and things like that. And so we had to shut down while we were putting all this together. And things slowly but surely became more and more real. And we started getting deliveries in crates of life-size statues of Ulysses S. Grant. And that was pretty amazing that day when those arrived. And so then we come to today. November 30th of last year, we actually had our grand opening, and we have been receiving many, many visitors since then, and it's been wonderful. We've been really excited. This is the entryway as you come into the new space on the 4th floor. You can see we've got a central desk there where we have volunteers or faculty and staff waiting to greet you as you come in. Directly behind the desk, we've got a small auditorium where you can watch a 9-minute orientation video that tells you, in much more succinct terms than I have just done, all about the history of these collections and things like that. And then you can go from there into the Grant Presidential Museum. I'll show you here. This is one of the first things you see as you walk in to the Grant Gallery. And this is probably one of the most arresting of the statues. People often stop there and just can't believe what they're seeing, because this is a statue of 17-year-old first-year cadet Ulysses S. Grant at the United States Military Academy in 1839. This is based on his actual height and weight from the records of the time. He was about 5'1" or 5'2", 115 to 117 pounds. And so again, people come in with this mental image of Grant, the equestrian statue, Grant, the great general, and what they see is a scared young teenager who is away from home for the first time, and he's standing there, and he's very vulnerable looking, right? And so this is something that I think really kind of amazes people with the humanity of it here. An interesting aside about the process of the statue creation. Studio Ice, we went up to Brooklyn and visited them in their studios, and they are classically trained sculptors, but they also incorporate technological advances that are pretty fascinating. And so one of the things that they brought out, they grilled us for several hours about all of these height and weight measurements of Grant and his physical appearance. And well, in this picture, he's got this on his lapel. What is that? And some of the things we said we don't know. But thanks to the good work of the editors who had come before us with the Papers Project, we had a lot of these height and weight numbers where Grant wrote a letter ordering a uniform, and he included his waist size and his inseam measurements and his measurements around his chest. And so what they were able to do, and this is part of their technique for creating these very lifelike statues, they actually find a model who matches the height and weight and the body type, and then they create a plaster mold of that person's body and use it as the basis for the statue. Then they sculpt the head and the hands in great detail with sort of traditional sculpting techniques in clay. And then they also work with historical costume designers and textile experts to dress the statue in clothing, right, that resembles period clothing. They take that clothing, they inject it with an epoxy resin, put all these pieces together, and coat it to harden it all, and you get this incredibly detailed, lifelike statue as part of the process. So it's really an amazing process, a lot of work that goes into it there. You can see another of the statues here and some of the pedestal cases and wall cases. This statue is based on kind of that iconic image of Grant at Cold Harbor where he's leaning against the tree. Very famous image there. And then we've got, this is the sort of turn around the corner. This is the president statue. This one always surprises me when I go in the back door of the gallery because I always think that it's a patron standing there looking at that interactive. It's just so lifelike. I think, why is that person wearing a coat? It's summertime. And then I realize it's this Grant statue there. But I want to spend a minute here talking also about the accompanying collection and the accompanying museum there that's just adjacent to the Grant Presidential Museum. And this is the Frank and Virginia Williams collection of Lincolniana. Frank Williams was the Chief Justice of the Rhode Island Supreme Court for many years. When he was a boy, he sat underneath a print of this particular painting of Lincoln and was curious about Lincoln, and so he began collecting things about Lincoln and reading about Lincoln. And this really set him on a journey, a lifetime journey of learning about Lincoln and becoming a Lincoln scholar. And so he assembled this massive collection of anything relating to Lincoln, original documents, books published about Lincoln, items that have connections to Lincoln, artwork related to Lincoln. And in the summer of 2017, he donated this collection to Mississippi State. And so this was a wonderful opportunity for us, and we had this space designated here for different exhibits, and the Lincoln collection fits right into that space. This is the back part of the gallery. There are so many items in this collection that our plan is to rotate things in and out pretty regularly. Right now we have some of the most interesting pieces there. But let me just take you, showing you the museum spaces, I want to take you a little behind the scenes tour real quick on areas that you may or may not see if you come to visit the museum, and I hope you will come to visit the museum. I mentioned the awkwardness of having a large group of boisterous elementary school students while somebody's trying to do research, right? Now we have a place where we can safely sequester our researchers in this separate reading room. And we had 100 elementary school students, I think, from Noxubee County Schools back in May, and we had researchers in the reading room, and they didn't even notice the students were there, and the students didn't notice them, and so it worked out great. But this gives us much more flexibility to be able to do that kind of, to support that kind of research and to do those sort of daily functions that sometimes were difficult in our old space. Right behind the reading room were the offices, and then behind the offices here we have a processing room. I like this picture of the processing room because you can see the processing work that's going on and how messy it is, and how we have boxes and we have a whole bunch of Lincoln busts that are covered there. And this is the kind of thing that we didn't have the space to spread out and do all of this work, but now we do have that. And then everybody's favorite destination in the summertime is our cold storage facility behind the processing room. We have compact shelving there, high-density shelving that allows us to shelve a lot of the congressional collections and all of the grant collection. We've got 96 file cabinets of grant material lined up in this space. But we keep it at 55 degrees and about 30% humidity year-round. You're all in Mississippi. You were all outside this morning on your way here. You know what a challenge it is to keep it at 55 degrees and 30% humidity. But this is good for the materials. It helps us preserve them. I like to go in there and just take a deep breath and feel like I'm in the mountains, right, with cool mountain air. All right, so in the last few minutes here that remain to me, I want to just point out a couple of things here that you will see as you go along, and then we'll have, I think, some time for Q&A here. This is one of my favorite items just because this has a direct connection to Grant himself. This is his personal copy of William Tecumseh Sherman's Memoirs. So Sherman, his great compatriot during the Civil War in 1875, sent Grant this embossed copy of his personal memoirs when they were first published. And so Grant himself would have read these. They would have influenced his own memoirs. And so this is just amazing to see the connection between those two men. But then also on the inside cover here, which this is what we have it open to in the exhibit space, we actually have some detailed notes on the provenance of how this ends up in our possession. If you look at the top signature there, it's hard to make out in this image, but Julia D. Grant signed her name in 1886. Right, so Grant died in 1885. Our presumption is the family was splitting up some of his possessions. And so Julia got this item in 1886, and it came into her possession as his widow. Then you look at the next signature there, down about halfway down the page. Frederick Dent Grant. Fred was the oldest son of Ulysses and Julia. It came into his possession in 1902, according to the date. That's the year that Julia died. So you can see that it passes from Grant to his wife and then to their son upon her death. And then Fred Grant's son, Ulysses S. Grant III, was one of the founding members of the Ulysses S. Grant Association. And so it's through him that it comes to us. His descendants are actually on the board of directors of the Grant Association to this day. And so that's just a very kind of personal piece there that I find interesting. Let me skip ahead, just in the interest of time. This is one, again, kind of back to that theme of presenting Grant and presenting Lincoln as real men who lived real lives. It's hard to see in this photograph here, but as you walk into the Lincoln Gallery, on the left, there's a desk. And it's a very nondescript desk, very functional, right? It's not ornate. But this is a desk that was in the courthouse in Petersburg, Illinois. And it was used by any lawyers that were coming into the courthouse to prepare for their cases, right, to get their paperwork together and things like that. One of those lawyers was Lincoln. This is Abraham Lincoln before he is a congressman. This is Abraham Lincoln long before he's a president. He's just a regular lawyer practicing his trade, and he's using this desk along with other lawyers in the courthouse there. And that's something that, to me, right, sometimes the connection to these men can seem kind of far away. But this is an object that was in the room with Lincoln that he touched, and here you are standing in that room with it. I also feel like I have an emotional connection to it because when we were moving this collection in, somehow I drew the short straw and had to supervise the team that was bringing them through the glass doors of the lobby. And we all sat there holding our breath as they angled it and angled it and angled it. But I'm glad to say the desk survived, and so did the glass doors. And so that's one reason I'm still employed at Mississippi State. So, but I think we're at time here, and so I'm going to, take questions. And Chris has a microphone, and so he will come to you where you are, and then we'll catch your question on the microphone as well. But
I'll respect the stipulations of your gag order from Carbondale.
yes, thank you.
Can you divulge any specifics on what those statues are worth?
On the
Grant's 4 statues.
so the value as far as the process. So thankfully, I was not involved in the financial decision-making process. And so I am unsure what the final cost was as far as those. I do know this, that Studio Ice is top of the line in this particular field. They have created statues for Mount Vernon, of George Washington at different stages of his life, and various Lincoln statues at sites around the country. And so this was, they were really the leader in this field of doing these very lifelike historical statues. And so it was quite a coup for us to be able to get them to do that work for us. So how's that for an evasive answer to your question there? So I'm also willing to say I just don't know. And so
I think your presentation's impressive. I was wondering, since you've come across some correspondence, lots of correspondence of Grant. Could you tell us anything about his beliefs about, he, of course, won the Civil War for Lincoln. And the Civil War was about slavery.
Right.
Could you tell us anything about Grant's feelings or beliefs on the question of slavery?
Yes. Yes, that's an excellent question. And this is something that is kind of a fascinating study in Grant's life. I think that before the Civil War, you could put Grant in sort of a general category of Americans who were not necessarily favorable to slavery, but who accepted it as a reality of day-to-day life. Grant's father was very well known as an abolitionist, but Grant himself was not as outspoken as an abolitionist in the pre-Civil War period. And actually at one point, Julia's family, they were slaveholders, and Grant owned a man named William Jones in the 1850s. What's fascinating about that particular case is that Grant actually let William Jones go free in a time that he was facing significant financial hardship. He did not leave records talking about his motivation there, right? But it's interesting to sort of see his evolution, because by the time the Civil War comes around, he is very much a part of the group who wants to end slavery. And then certainly in his presidency, he was a president who advocated for African American civil rights and always talked about the central cause of the Civil War being slavery. So I think you kind of see sort of an evolution in his beliefs, even though he didn't talk a lot directly about it before the war, of sort of a sense of general acceptance, if not necessarily favoring slavery, moving more toward a stronger abolitionist perspective, recognizing the evils of slavery. And so I think that's kind of an interesting aspect to his life, even though there's not a lot of documentary evidence for that early period. So, excellent question. Thank you.
Excellent presentation. I was just curious as to how many visitors tour this each year.
That's a good question. The last stats that I had heard through the end of, I think it was March, these are the official numbers, we had between basically December 1st and March of this year, we had about 3,000 visitors. Throughout the summer months, we've been averaging each day what we used to have every 1 to 2 weeks in the old space. So we are very pleased to be able to have more friends over these days than we used to. So, oh, good question. When the library is open on the weekends, we have weekend hours, and that's from 10 to 2 on Saturdays. But then Monday through Friday, we're open 7:30 to 5 p.m. each day, unless the library is in reduced hours for intercession moments or things like that. So, parking is terrible. Yes, because it's a college campus. But if you contact us in advance, we can help you get a visitor parking pass in advance. Even if you don't contact us in advance, you can go to the Roberts building on campus, more commonly known as the building with the Burger King in it, and they can get you a visitor parking pass. You can also park in the visitor parking at the Barnes & Noble over by the stadium and ride the shuttle, because the shuttle stops at the library as well. They're working on a more permanent solution for parking, but yes, if you come during the summertime, there's much more parking available. And even if they ticket you, we have friends who can take care of that. Just bring it to us and we'll help you out. So,
is there a Grant National Library? Because it's rather difficult for me to think that Mississippi State would have a Grant Library, and he was the president, and most presidents have a national library.
This is a good question, yes. So we're not part of the National Archives and Records Administration's presidential library system. That system actually begins with Herbert Hoover. I think the idea really began with FDR, and then as I like to imagine it, Herbert Hoover was sort of standing there saying, hey, wait, I was a president too. Won't you let me have one? And so Herbert Hoover is the first in that system. If there's a presidential library, if a pre-Herbert Hoover president has a presidential library, it's usually run by a foundation or some type of partnership that's a private organization like this one. So there is no other grant presidential library or sort of national library. This is that repository because we have such a centralized repository of all grant-related documents in one place. So.
This is, with expected protestations, a little bit of a self-promotion, but I do have a question.
That's okay. We're open to self-promotion here, right?
My great-great-grandmother was Mary Ann Dent, who was the mother of General James Longstreet.
Yes.
The Confederate general. Mary Ann Dent was a distant cousin of Julia Dent, Grant's wife.
Yes.
So, in addition to that, I'm kin to Samuel L. Clemens, AKA Mark Twain.
Yes.
So you can see that I have quite an interest in Grant through all of that. So if I wanted to delve into this in great detail and find some maybe unlimited facts, what would be the best way? Should I call and make an appointment telling them exactly what I'm looking for, or more or less, and have somebody assigned to me to kind of guide me once I get there? What is the process of really researching something for an amateur?
Yeah, well, number one, we would love to have you come and do research at the Grant Presidential Library. And yes, your best bet would be to either call or email. We have on our website a form where if you're a researcher, you can let us know you're coming, let us know what you're interested in, and then we can pull materials and have them available for you. And we have people throughout the day from 7:30 to 5 who are staffing that reading room and can help you pull additional materials, help you figure out places to look. Unpublished materials in our collection would be a great starting point because there's some family documentation that isn't part of the papers of Ulysses S. Grant, and also our vertical files. I know we have a big vertical file on Longstreet. Even contains a lot of good information about the controversy as to whether he was a groomsman, a best man, or what at the wedding. And so, so that would probably be worth your time to look at there. But yeah, just contact us and we'll be glad to set you up and help you.
Did I hear you correctly when you said the justice from Rhode Island donated his materials to Mississippi State?
Correct.
How
Yes.
did that happen?
Yes.
What's the connection?
Well, we like to say we've got all kinds of great hooks, right? Grant in Mississippi State, that's a great hook, right? People are not going to just scroll past that. Same principle with Chief Justice Williams and the Lincolniana collection. Chief Justice Williams is actually the president of the Grant Association. And he has been one of the leaders of the Lincoln Forum for many years. And so that relationship began developing as the Grant Project moved to Mississippi State. He had always had in his mind that he wanted his collection to go to a southern university and to a university that did not have a similar collection, because he wanted to open that up to students in particular and people from the community who ordinarily wouldn't have access to that type of collection. And so through that relationship that developed over the years, he was willing to really make that decision, which I think was a tough decision for him, right? Because it's a very personal thing to collect those materials throughout a lifetime. But that's really the story there behind it, is that relationship development over time. So.
Did members of the association any of them object to the papers coming to Mississippi? Did they want them to go somewhere else, or did other people bid to get them in their locations?
This is a good question. There were additional proposals that were put forth, but Mississippi State's was the strongest proposal. And there was unanimous agreement within the association that that was where the collection needed to go. And so I think that's just really a testament to the vision of MSU's leadership, both in the university administration and the library, to really be able to put sort of nuts and bolts to a proposal and say, this is what we are willing to do because we understand the value of this project and want to move forward with it. But there weren't any objections within the association. Well, I think this is where the influence and presence of Dr. John F. Marzalak is really key, because he had been at Mississippi State since the 1970s, working in the history department. He's also a Giles Distinguished Professor. And so, he likes to joke that he accepted the position as executive director and managing editor without knowing where the project was going. And he was like, that was a terrible decision. I could have had to pick up and move after 40 years in Starkville, and I didn't want to do that. But that, I think, also it really fits with the sort of long tradition of historical scholarship, and especially Civil War scholarship at Mississippi State University, that there was just a really good fit in that regard. So.
Dr. Mosley is also a noted historian.
Exactly.
He's written a number of books.
Yes.
In fact, he was my professor.
Oh, very good. Do you know his nickname then?
I know
He-
John, but
well-
I don't know him.
Well, he was nicknamed apparently the Cheerful Assassin, because he's such a nice guy, he's such a smiling guy, but when you got your paper draft back, it had been ripped to shreds. And so you may remember some of that as well. So.
Did Grant ever have an order of his, or maybe more than one, that were overruled by President Lincoln?
Yes, yes. The most celebrated of those was what has gone down in history as the sort of infamous General Orders Number 11, where Grant issued an order where I believe the wording is he expelled Jews as a class from the Department of the Tennessee, right? And there are many ways, scholars have kind of tried to interpret this and figure out what was going on there. Some stories are that his father, who was sort of a noted schemer, had come south trying to get involved in the illicit cotton trade and trade on his son's name, but he was partnered with a Jewish man in that, and Grant was sort of striking back at that. Others are basically that Grant sort of fell into the incorrect stereotyping of his day, but there was such an outcry over that order that Lincoln rescinded it, and Grant basically spent the rest of his life, especially his political career, trying to dig out of that hole that he had created there. He was actually, I think, the first president to attend the dedication of a synagogue while he was in office. And so he spent the rest of his life really making overtures to the Jewish community in the United States and saying, look, that was a mistake. I never should have issued that order. It was incorrectly done. But that's probably the most celebrated or most noteworthy of the ones that, his orders that were overturned. So.
You made mention of original documents and then copies of other documents stored other places.
Yes.
What percentage of the collection here is original, and then what is copies?
That's a good question. I don't know that I can put a percentage on it. I'll give you small and large. Small percentage are original documents, just because acquiring those is time and money intensive. Most of what we have are copies, but this is where the Grant Presidential Library at Mississippi State really is such a boon to researchers, is that to see all the original documents, you would have to travel from repository to repository to look at all of those. You'd even have to travel around the world because there are, I think, 5 original Grant letters at Masaya University in Japan. And so you can do that, or you can come to Starkville, Mississippi, where we have somewhat affordable hotel rates, and your research dollars will go a lot further there. So that's right. That's right. We'll get you the parking pass. Yes.
I was just going to mention I've been to the museum, and
Oh, very good.
for anybody that hasn't, it's outstanding. the other thing that's really neat, once you find a parking place and you get into Mitchell Library, you'll find right across the corridor from the Grant Presidential Library is a fantastic music museum, the Templeton Music Museum.
Exactly.
And then in the same building is the John Grisham Reading Room.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's, I think, that other, the museum with the Sonny Montgomery and Stennis items. And Bowen.
That's right. David Bowen's collection is part of the Congressional and Political Research Center. Yeah.
I was just going to ask a question. Just like I would love to figure out a way to get downstairs in this building and look at the 90% of the items that aren't on display. Your storage area for the Grant Library, are you going to rotate anything in the museum over time of those items?
Yes, our plan is to rotate documents and artifacts in and out. We've actually already, just since our opening, changed out some of the exhibits because we had new materials donated by Grant descendants. And so we wanted to go ahead and bring those in as part of an exhibit for the Grant Association annual meeting back in May. So yeah, so if you come and visit, some of the things you see may have changed out by the next visit. But thank you for the personal testimonial. You can attest that you and I did not collude on this beforehand, so that's great. Oh, very good, very good. Thank you for your assistance there. But yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned we are kind of in what we call the museum district of the library, because we've got the Templeton Museum right across the way and the Grisham Collection and also the Stennis Montgomery Room down on the 3rd floor. So there are lots of exhibits that you can see just in one stop there in the library. So,
Did Grant and General Stephen D. Lee have any association with one another?
So there's a very interesting connection between Stephen D. Lee's family and Grant's family. So Stephen D. Lee, right, was the first president of Mississippi State when it was Mississippi A&M College. He was a Confederate general at Vicksburg. So he was paroled by Grant in the aftermath of the surrender of Vicksburg. We don't know that the two men ever really crossed paths or they didn't have a significant correspondence in any way like that. But interestingly, their families became close friends after the Civil War and even after Grant's death, to the point that when they dedicated the Stephen D. Lee Memorial at Vicksburg, Fred Grant was the featured speaker at that event. And then when they had a Grant birthday celebration in Galena, Illinois in the early 20th century, Blewett Lee was the featured speaker at that event. So yeah, those connections between the Lee family and the Grant family are pretty fascinating just to look at there, because it's kind of amazing to see those two families really coming together in the post-war period and even into the early 20th century. So.
That may be all the time we have for questions today. I did want to answer, though, Robert, we are actually working up a collections tour that we'll be offering
very good.
for folks who do want to take a look at the downstairs here. So we hear
popular demand. Very good.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming today. We do have copies, I should have mentioned, of the memoirs for sale in the bookstore next door here. I hope that you will join us all back here next week. But help me thank David Nolen for this fabulous performance.
Thank you all. Thank you all.